Okay, so we're going to start in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, a little bit of a recap before we get into our main passage. Here's what it says in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And so there have been two main analogies we've been looking through as the author of Hebrews is trying to help his audience, but also us, grapple with how to understand this Christian life and how to understand what we're going through in this Christian life. And the first analogy we encountered several months ago is this analogy that our Christian life is like a race. It's like a race. And then in the past few weeks, we started to explore this idea that the Christian life is like a father who's disciplining his child. So there's this race analogy, but there's also this family analogy of what God is doing in our lives. And so we saw a couple weeks ago in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 5 through 7, here's what it says. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him, for the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. For it is for discipline you have to endure. God is treating you as sons, for what son is there whom his father does not discipline? And when we first look at those two ideas of the race and of discipline, they seem very disconnected. They seem like maybe the author is just transitioning from one thought to another. But a couple weeks ago, Jason Van, who came up here to speak, took us through a very in-depth study to see why the idea of the race and the idea of discipline are not two separate ideas, but actually quite interconnected. Because the truth about the race that we run is that this race is hard at times. This race is discouraging at times. This race is full of struggles against sin or struggles against outside persecution or even struggles, as we'll see in our passage, against internal disunity within the church. This is a hard race. It's full of difficulties. If it's not, you're running the wrong race, by the way. But what we are trying to understand is maybe those struggles and those difficulties that we experience while trying to run for God is just the way that the Father disciplines us. And so Jason took us through this word study about what it means to discipline. And in the Greek, the disciplining, it's not about punishment, but it's actually about training. It's not about discipline, but it's actually about training. And he used this Greek word, paideia. And he took us through the Bible to show us that paideia was really this picture of the Father doing something in our lives that's for our benefit, but we also have to acknowledge that what the Father does in our lives and what we go through is sometimes really uncomfortable and things that we would maybe prefer not to go through at times. And so what the author is grappling with here is, how do we view hardships? How do you view hardships when you're running and all of a sudden things get hard? How do you view that? Because one way we could view hardships is that maybe God is punishing us. And that's why we're going through this. Or one way we could understand hardships, and the way that we sometimes don't want to understand hardships, is we're going through a tough time because of our own stupid decisions and our own sinfulness. That no one else is responsible for this. As much as we want to blame God or blame the circumstances, a lot of times the hardships we go through are just because we have made bad decisions in our sinfulness. So is that how we should view hardships? Should we view hardships as God punishment? But instead, what the author is inviting us, what God is inviting us to do, is to view hardships not as punishment, but as training and discipline from the Father, especially as we're trying to run this race faithfully. So discipline is for our good, but it is uncomfortable. But here's what's very important about our understanding of discipline. The Christian understanding of discipline and the Greek understanding of discipline are very, very different, because the end goal for the Greeks in this training was so that their children would become well-rounded, educated people. So the goal for the Greeks is to make this well-rounded, well-trained adult who's ready to function in society. And that's not a bad goal, but the Christian goal in training and discipline is not that you and I become well-rounded. The Christian goal, God's goal in disciplining us and training us, is actually to make us more Christ-like. And so the hardships we experience, the difficult seasons that we endure are there to train us to be more Christ-like. Think about the Hebrews. The Hebrews were facing all sorts of persecution. The Hebrews were facing all sorts of pressure from the government just because of what they believed. And I'm sure there were times where they probably wanted to quit. And there were times where they probably wanted to stop running the race. But what God does is he doesn't change the circumstance. Instead, he changes our perception of the circumstance. He doesn't take the problems away, but God is trying to help us understand that the problems and difficulties we're going through are not going to change, but instead what needs to change is our attitude and understanding of how God is working in the midst of those difficult circumstances. And if you're going through a tough time, I want to say this. If you're going through a tough time, you know what that means? It means God is working. If you're going through a difficult season as you're trying to run this race faithfully, it means God is working. It means you're a son of God. Because as we read in the passage, a father disciplines his son. See, in the Hebrew culture, the responsibility for training up the children ultimately rests on the father. The responsibility for how the child turns out in maturity ultimately rests on the father, not on tutors and not on teachers. That's why in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 14, Paul writes this, I do not write these things to make you ashamed, but to admonish you as my beloved children. For though you have countless guides, in other words, you have teachers, you have mentors, okay? And that's good and that's important, but look what he says. You do not have many fathers. Because a mentor and a guide can at any point say, okay, I'm done with you. I don't hold ultimate responsibility. But a father holds ultimate responsibility for our growth into Christ-likeness. So Paul says, for I became your father in Christ. So we have tutors, we have teachers, we have coaches. And in the culture I teach in, a lot of what parents expect is that their child is developed through the teacher. Or their child's character is developed through the coaching. Or the child's learning is happening through the tutors. That's why there's a thriving Bushiban culture in Taiwan. Because parents think, for my child to learn, they need a tutor. For my child to develop character, they need a coach. No, no, no. The Bible makes it clear that the ultimate responsibility of how we grow as Christians into Christ-likeness is not based on me or whatever pastor stands up here. It's ultimately based on the Father. And so if we're going through a season of discipline and of training, what that means is you're a child of God. What that means is the Father is working in you and you're his child. So that sets us up for today's passage. Are we okay? Are we ready? Okay, I can't sense readiness, but we're going to go anyway. Hebrews chapter 12, here's our passage, verses 14 through 17. Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled, that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterwards, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. So let's understand the flow before we dig in. Okay, so here's the flow. There's this race, and it's a difficult race. But the difficulties we encounter are not to be seen as punishment. They're to be seen as discipline or training. There's this race we're running, and as things get hard, what it's doing is it's training us to be more and more like Christ. And part of the result of that training, if we look at verse 14, is holiness. Part of that training is that we end up being set apart and being different from the world and instead more like Christ. Holiness is not something we can force or manufacture. Holiness is not something you can fake. It is a work that the Father does in you through discipline and training, and it is evidence of God's work in you. That's holiness. You can't fake it. Has to be something God does. You know, I went into work, the past couple of weeks I've been going into work even though I don't have to. mainly because I'm a workaholic. But I got some really interesting comments because when my colleagues saw me, they said, "You look really refreshed. You look really relaxed." And in my mind, I'm like, I'm not. I'm completely exhausted. Like the school year has exhausted me. The things happening at church in the season has exhausted me. We just had friends visit from the U.S., and so we showed them around Taiwan. And I realized most of the meaningful activities in Taiwan are outdoors. And outdoors means an encounter with the demon of humidity. And the demon of humidity really saps your energy. And so I was exhausted, but several people say, "Hey, you're looking good. You're looking relaxed and refreshed and rejuvenated." I'm like, and I went home thinking, why did they think that? And I realized why they thought that. They thought that because of how I was dressed. Because I was not dressed in my work clothes. I was dressed super casually. I even wore a hat. I never wear a hat. And so they saw that and they go, "Oh, Leo's wearing a hat, therefore he must be relaxed. He must be in summer mode." When I was absolutely not in summer mode. I'm still pretty drained now. And so as I thought about that, I realized this, man, we can fool the world into thinking that we have it all together. And we can fool the world into thinking that we're all right and that we're happy, even though inside we're not. We can fake happiness. We can fake having it all together. But the one thing we cannot fake is holiness. Because holiness is based on God's standard. And God knows our inside, not just looking at our outside. And so the work of discipline that God does is this internal transformation that changes our heart so that bubbles up to the outside. That's how God works. That's why in 2 Corinthians, I love this verse because it speaks so clearly to me. Chapter 4, verse 16. "So we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away." That was me. That's still me. "Our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." I love that because what is God saying? In this race, you're going to look horrible on the outside at times because it's going to beat you down. Life is going to get difficult as you're trying to follow me. But in that, there's discipline and training happen. And what I'm doing is I'm changing the inside. You may look like a mess on the outside, which was the opposite of me. I looked great on the outside, but I was a mess on the inside. But God's saying, you may look like a mess on the outside, but what I'm doing, the result of this discipline is this holiness, this Christ-likeness that can only come as I use those challenges and difficult seasons to transform you into more and more like me. That's what God is saying. That's the result of this race and of the training that we go through. And training is not pleasant, right? Training's not pleasant. It's just not. So we're going to dig more into the other verses in our main passage next week, but I just want to focus lastly on verses 16 through 17. So if we could look at that. Here's what it says. Then see to it, okay, I think is the previous verse, that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterwards, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. Okay, so let's pause here. So here's the train of thought. You're running this race. This race is hard. God uses the hardships to discipline you, not to punish you only. Okay? Part of that is holiness. And then they say, don't be like Esau, because Esau was like this. Now, here's what's weird about this. There is no emphasis or evidence in the Bible that Esau was immoral in the specific way that this verse talks about. Verse 16. That's not emphasized in the Old Testament, right? That Esau was immoral in this way. So what's going on? Well, there was a train of thought that sort of extrapolated from the story of Esau and said, well, he did this, so he must have done these other things. So there's sort of this extra biblical teaching that was happening among Jewish rabbis that said Esau sinned in this specific way. Okay, we don't know. So maybe that's what the author of Hebrews is picking up on here. But even though that to me is a little bit unclear, what is very clear is that Esau is being used as an example of someone not to follow. Right? All of chapter 11 was all these people that we should follow. Moses and Enoch and all these people that we should emulate. But here Esau is clearly being shown as someone not to follow, because previously we said what? The evidence of discipline is holiness, but here it says what? Esau is unholy. Esau is unholy. He's not being transformed. So what did he do, right? What did he do? So let's dig into what he did. Genesis chapter 25, verse 29 through 34. Here's what it's referring to. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came from the field and was exhausted. That's how I feel. And Esau said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stew, for I'm exhausted. Therefore his name was called Edom. Jacob said, sell me your birthright now. Esau said, I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? Jacob said, swear to me now. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Why was he unholy? Why is Esau in Hebrews called unholy? It's this, because he rejected the call to keep running the race. He rejected the call to keep running the race. It says he despised the call, his birthright. We'll get more into that. He rejected the call to keep running the race. When things became uncomfortable, Esau traded in the calling for relief. Esau traded in difficulty for what he thought would make his life easier. And we all sort of give in to this temptation that life will be easier and better if we stop running the race for a little while. I just need a breath, God. I just need a break, God. And there are times where God says, yeah, stop and rest. But the temptation is to think, if I just stop running this race, if I just disconnect from church community, if I just stop following God, and for just a little bit, God, just take a break, then I'm going to feel relief. This is quick fix, right? I'm sure the Hebrews, as they were going through persecution at some point, felt, if we just stop, tell the government, okay, we don't believe in Jesus anymore, things will get a lot better. Let us just catch our breath just for a little bit. I'm just going to stop. Right? Because it all comes down to how we're viewing hardships. Are hardships inconveniences to be avoided, or are hardships opportunity for God to train you? We have to make that choice. Are hardships and difficulties inconveniences that we try to avoid at all costs? Or are hardships and inconveniences, as difficult as they may be, actually opportunities for God to work in us? You got to make that call. And sometimes we see hardships as these things that we have to avoid. And so we give up the race to get that breath of relief. So what's this birthright? What is this birthright? Let's see. Why is this so serious? The birthright was the privilege and calling to carry on the blessing that was originally given to Abraham. What was the blessing? The blessing was be fruitful, multiply. The blessing was basically this reality of a fullness of life as God intended it to be. So Abraham and his lineage were meant to bring to the world the fullness of life, the fullness of creation as God intended it to be. That's no light matter. That's not like an easy calling that you trade for some soup. Do you know what I mean? That's not an inheritance you just give away. If I stood to inherit billions of dollars, but I was so hungry, I'm not going to be like, oh, please give me some Euro Mian. I'll give you my inheritance. That's ridiculous, right? This is a big deal. And our calling as we run the race is really no different. We're to bring that promise of fullness of life, of creation functioning properly, of the joy of the Lord. We're to bring that reality into this world. That's our calling as we're running the race. It's the same. And when we give up that calling by saying, I'm just going to stop running, we're actually not gaining comfort. We're losing the privilege of bringing the kingdom to a dying world. That's a big deal. But there are times in reality, like Esau, there are times in reality that maybe we have gone through where we just either want to stop or we want to run a different race. And we have said, yes, 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 God. And we've obeyed God and we've taken steps with God. We've said yes. And then there comes a point where sometimes we want to draw a line and we say, no, that's too far, God. I have gone up to this point. I draw this line right here. That's it. And we want to draw that line. This is as far as I want to go. I'm not going any further. I've given you enough. I've done enough. That's too far. Do we all have that? I think we all have that line, unconsciously or consciously. There's this line that if we know God says cross this line, we're like, nope, not going to do it. Not going to keep running. I think of Jonah. Right? Jonah, God said, go to Nineveh. But he had this choice to go to Nineveh or to go to this place called Jaffa. Let me show you the pictures of modern day Nineveh and Jaffa. Okay, can we show that picture? Okay, so Nineveh is here in the black and white. This is modern day current, right? Jaffa is that on the left, and on the right, that's Jaffa. Where would you rather go? A desert city full of sin, or a nice coastal town on the ocean, on the sea? Where would you rather go? Right? If I'm Jonah and I'm tired, I want to go there. I want to go to the place that looks more comfortable, because the most convenient thing when we're weary is to run to a place that brings us comfort, to go the other way. Because the race brings us to places and intersects us with people that we would rather not be at or deal with. The race brings us into relationships with people that we would rather not have, and seasons that we would rather avoid. And there's always other races we can choose to run. There's so many different choices of where we can run. We can run to God's calling, or we can run to comfort. We can run to what's easier. But Esau said no. He drew a line. I'm starving. No. Jonah drew a line. No, I'm not going to go to those people. Right? And these are pretty big no's. And there's times I've seen it in people's lives, I've done it in my life, where we just tell God straight up, no. And we give God this big no. But you know what's interesting about those big no's? Those big no's don't just come like that. Those big no's are actually built up as a product of these micro moments of no. You know, there's this phrase lately of microaggressions. And I think there's these times where we have these microaggressions to God's call, where we're like, no, God. No. It's a little thing, so I can say no to a little thing, God. It's not a big thing. And then our no's keep growing to more no's and no's. These tiny little things, to the point where saying the big no and drawing the line becomes easier. So what we need to be aware of is those times where we do stop running the race, even for moments, okay? Don't get me wrong, sometimes God calls you to rest. But those times where we do stop running the race are these little micro no's that, if we're not careful, really get us into the habit and make it much easier for us to say the big no, when the calling and the choice is a much bigger deal. But on the flip side of that, if there's these microaggressions, micro no's, I also think that there's these micro yeses. That as we just faithfully obey and say yes to God in little things, it could be the tiniest thing where God just says, just get up early this morning and do this. Or just give a little more, tithe a little more. Just reach out to that person. These little micro yeses also build up our faith and train us to be able to say the big yes when God calls us to do something much more grand and difficult. Because saying no and running the race, verse 17 makes it very clear what happens when we stop running the race and exchange it for something more convenient. It says, for you know that afterwards, when he, talking about Esau, desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. Rejecting the race will always end in regret. I heard someone say this morning, as I was listening to a message on the way here, that I would rather live a life where I come before God and God says, you know, you should have really slowed down instead of running so hard, than a life where we come before God and he says, you should have really run the race instead of slowing down all the time. You know what I mean? Like, I would rather go full on and God said, I never called you to do that. You should have rested. I'd rather go full on than be someone who said these micro no's and ends up realizing, I missed it. Someone also said the pain of regret is always worse than the cost of obedience. Let that sink in. The pain of regret is always worse than the cost of obedience in God's kingdom. But look, that's a very negative way to view things. Okay? You're not going to motivate me to run a race just because you say, if you don't run this race, you'll regret it. Okay? I don't like running, first of all. So if you try to motivate me to run the Taipei Marathon saying you'll regret it, I'll be like, yeah, right. Okay? That's a very negative way to view things. The risk of missing out is not a great motivation in my opinion of why we should run the race. So how should we kind of view this in terms of not wanting to be Esau and trading in our calling and birthright for convenience? I've been thinking a lot this week about Jake's message, and if you weren't here, go listen to it. I mean, it was quite powerful. And the thrust of Jake's message last week was really about this idea of how he had come to a point where he relied on himself and his own talents instead of God. And the thrust of Jake's message was really about realizing that it wasn't the production and it wasn't the talent, but it was really God's Spirit working in our weakness. I also thought about something Chris Lowe said at the end of service. Chris basically thought about sort of how church has been going. And he said this, he says, you know, we've been grinding. These weren't his exact words, but like we've been grinding, and because we've been grinding, we've been able to put together a Sunday service. Sunday happens every week, right? Sunday service happens miraculously every week. We're short on help. A lot of people are overseas. There's been a time of transition, but because we have been willing to grind, because people have been willing to step in, we've been able to put Sunday service together. It's been fine. And, you know, we've had good fellowship, and God has done amazing things through the space and time that we've provided. But he said this, you know, like, we can grind it out, but sometimes when you're grinding, you kind of forget why you're doing it. And you start to depend on your own strength and your own discipline. I could honestly, because I've done this long enough, put a message together with enough hours. You give me 10 hours a week, I can put a message together that will be somewhat coherent. Okay, and a good mixture of making you feel guilty and hopeful. Mostly guilty. And I can do that because of discipline. But that's not the kind of discipline that God is after. And that's not the kind of race I want to be running. I don't want to run a race just because I'm disciplined enough to run the race, because you know what that's going to mean? That's going to mean that I'm going to be the type of person that does, you know, my quiet time, comes to church diligently, gives offering diligently, preaches the word diligently, but has no relationship with God. That's not the kind of race I want to run. That's not how I want to run the race, because when you're in survival mode, I'm very much in survival mode lately. This church, in some ways, has been in survival mode lately. Sometimes we stop asking the question of why we do it. We just keep asking the question of what do we need to do next? And we all come to that place in the race where we're like, okay, what do I got to do next in order to get just to the next point? Like Michael Owen was sharing about running and how, you know, what keeps him motivated is just that next, like, water break, right? And I can totally understand that, but sometimes we get so fixated on what do we have to do next that we completely stop running the race asking, like, why are we running the race? Why are we doing the race? How should we run the race? It's like, I'm running, God, but are you running it the way you're supposed to? It doesn't matter, I'm running, God, look at my forward progress. Look at my discipline. Look at my dedication to the cause. So I think we need to go back to the beginning of chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 1 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." Look at verse 2. "Looking to Jesus, the founder," some versions say author, "and perfecter of our faith." That's how we run. We don't run because we're disciplined runners. We don't run because we have to or we want to avoid regret. We run looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So if we want to avoid just grinding it out and just running the race because we feel like we have to or we're told to, we do that by fixing our eyes on him. A healthy view of Christ is critical to how we run this race. A healthy view of Christ is critical to how we run this race. Because there will be times like Esau where it feels like stopping to rest is more valuable than the reason for running. It feels like that stew is more valuable than our calling. There are going to be times where it feels like stopping the race seems much more valuable than the reason for running the race. But that's only true if we misunderstand the reason for running the race. We run this race looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter. Meaning as I'm running and as I'm tired, I need to look and say, oh yeah, you're the one who's writing the story of my life. You're the author of my faith. You're the one that is perfecting this and training this. I don't pursue holiness. If we pursue holiness, we're going to fail. And we're going to be tired because we're going to fail a lot and feel bad that we can't be holy. You don't just pursue holiness. If you pursue holiness, you're going to get tired. We pursue Jesus. Because it's him and him alone that not only writes and authors our life, it's him and him alone that perfects and trains and pours into us and transforms us so that we could keep running this race. Those micro yeses are not based on our will and our ability and our obedience. Those micro yeses is the Spirit working in us. And so I've tried to be very conscious this week as I've been preparing this message of, like, I get this thought sometimes of just keep going, right? Because I used to hike a lot. I always told people that I hike, we'll rest at the top. Resting is for weaklings, right? And so I'm just like, just keep going, and you'll get to the top. Just close your eyes, just bear the pain. I've been very conscious this week of, instead of approaching the race that way, of just keep going, of really taking a step back and really allowing Jesus to be the center of what I do and really depending on him and not my experience or gifting or knowledge to be able to put a message together, but really relying on him to speak to me so that I have something meaningful to share with us, to really transform me so I'm not just grinding out the race. I've been trying to be very conscious of that, of looking to him as I run the race, not looking to the goals, not looking to the checklist that needs to be done, not looking to what's expected of me, not looking at the failures of how I messed up the race, but looking to him and just kind of clinging on. And the image I've been getting is, there's always those ridiculous scenes in movies where like someone's hanging off a cliff and their friend is up top and they grab their hand right as they're about to fall, right? And then they're trying to climb up, but they're having such a difficult time like climbing up. And what does the hero always say? They always say, just look at me, right? You can do this. Look at me. And I'm like, what? How's that helpful, right? Like, okay, like just look at me. Just look. And for whatever reason, looking at the hero somehow enables them to climb up, right? And as I was thinking about that, I was like, that's all God is saying, right? Don't look at the circumstances, because if you look at the circumstances, that's going to be very discouraging. Don't ignore them. They're there. You're hanging off a cliff. Some of us feel that way. You're in danger. But don't look around, don't look down. They always say, don't look down, don't look down, right? Okay, right. What does it matter if I look down? Why? Because when we look down, we take our eyes off what's holding us in the first place. And we turn our attention away from who we should be focusing on. And that's when we sometimes lose our grip. And all I want to say today through all that is maybe for some of us who have felt like we need to draw the line and say, God, this is too far. Maybe some of us who, like Esau, would say, gosh, I just want to stop. Just give me a break, God. Some of us who maybe have that attitude of just grinding it out. That as we're sort of on this precipice of burnout or precipice of just falling away, that we just look at him. And we just remember that he's the author. He wrote our lives. He's the perfecter. He's the one working in our lives to get us to the finish line. And that we, despite the circumstance, despite the pit that we're dangling over, he's not going to let go. And that he is willing and able to empower us to keep going and to pull us out of that. But we got to fix our eyes. We got to look to him. So can we just spend a little bit of time reflecting? The theme really the past whole month, not just when I speak, but as we've had Jason and Jake, others kind of share the word, is that there's times in this race where we will be weary. Physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, just weary. But those are the moments where God says, look at me. I'll get you through this. Look at me. I'm here for you. Look at me. I'm the one who saved you and will continue to save you as you keep running. So are there spaces where you just feel weary? Are there lines you've drawn that God has asked you, go here, but no, I can't. I'm done. Could we allow God to just bring those to the surface so that he can heal? So let me give us just a moment in our silence to reflect, and then we'll move on to the next part.